Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're getting into some really challenging but I think incredibly important material with Resmaa Menakem's book, My Grandmother's Hands. And the core idea here is pretty radical, actually. It suggests that things like white body supremacy, racialized trauma, and healing aren't just concepts or beliefs. They actually live in our bodies physically, not just in our minds. So our goal today is to kind of unpack that visceral experience and see what Menakem suggests as a path towards healing for everyone involved.
Right. And it is a complex stuff, no doubt about it. But what's powerful about the book is that it really does offer a way forward. Menakem stresses that healing isn't just intellectual, It's about truly experiencing the sensations of this journey with each step.
Experiencing the sensation.
It means feeling it, not just thinking about it. That's how we move towards real understanding and change.
Okay, so let's dive into that. What makes looking at racism and trauma through the lens of the body? What makes that so, revolutionary?
Well, the really groundbreaking piece is this idea that white body supremacy isn't just an ideology floating around. It's described as a cultural operating system that literally resides in our bodies.
An operating system.
Yeah. Meaning every white-skinned body, regardless of what they consciously believe, benefits from this system automatically. It shapes decisions, choices, reactions, often below the level of awareness. It's like the air we breathe just there.
And he brings in this concept, the lizard brain. Can you break that down? What part does that play in all this?
Absolutely. So the lizard brain, that's our most primitive brain part. Its only job, basically, is survival.
Right, the instinctual stuff.
Exactly. Fight, flee, freeze, or rest, those basic commands. And it's incredibly fast, purely reflexive. The key thing is it bypasses our thinking brain when it senses danger, whether that danger is real or just perceived. It just reacts instantly.
Okay, so it's acting before we even consciously think.
Precisely. And that's where the connection to racialized trauma comes in. White body supremacy as this operating system really hits hard at that reflexive lizard brain level. It can trigger an automatic constriction, a sense of threat, often unconsciously.
Can you give an example of how that plays out?
Yeah, Menakem mentions that study, the economics one with the resumes, where identical resumes were sent out, but names perceived as African-American, like Jamal, got way fewer callbacks than names like Emily.
Right, I remember that.
And the point isn't necessarily that every hiring manager was consciously biased. It shows how this deeper operating system can work invisibly within institutions, influencing choices at that gut lizard brain level.
So these reactions are deep, almost instinctual. How does Menakem explain how this gets, passed down? It's not just about one person's experience, is it? He talks about historical trauma.
Exactly. It's bigger than the individual. He explains that trauma gets passed from generation to generation, and not just through stories or culture, but through genetics, family structures, even the biochemistry of egg, sperm, and the womb.
Wow. So it's literally cellular.
It seems that way. There's research suggesting trauma can actually change how our DNA is expressed, epigenetics, and that can be inherited, like that study with the mice.
Oh, with the scent.
Yeah, where a fear of a specific smell was passed down generations. And studies on children of Holocaust survivors show similar patterns. Menakem also connects it to the ACE's study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. That research clearly shows how repeated childhood trauma doesn't just affect mental health. It fundamentally changes our bodies, our physical health long term, and that makes it more likely that the trauma gets passed on.
It's a lot to take in. The idea that it's not just a narrative, but something our bodies physically carry. Which brings us to the origins of racial trauma. And this is where Menakem really flips the script, doesn't he? He argues it didn't start where we usually think.
Right. He pushes back against the idea that it all began in 1619 when Africans arrived in America. He argues we need to go much further back to medieval Europe to understand the trauma already present in white bodies.
Medieval Europe. How so?
Well, he describes the sheer brutality of life back then. Think about public torture, the rack, floggings, drawing, and quartering all happening out in the open, like entertainment. Generations experienced or witnessed this extreme violence.
Okay.
So many European colonists arriving in America weren't just adventurers. They were people carrying deep, unresolved trauma from that background. They brought, as Menakem puts it, brutality and a great deal of their trauma with them.
So this pre-existing trauma, this normalization of violence was already there. That really reframes things. But then how did race, whiteness and blackness enter the picture? Because initially, the colonists weren't thinking in those specific terms, right?
Exactly. That's a crucial point Menakem makes. These categories, white, black, race, they weren't natural or inevitable. They were invented, socially constructed in the 1600s. He notes that terms like white person only really start showing up in documents around the 1680s.
Invented. Okay,
Yeah.
that sounds deliberate.
It was highly strategic. Think late 1600s, early 1700s. Wealthy white landowners had a problem. Poor white indentured servants and enslaved black people were living together, working together, sometimes even rebelling together, like in Bacon's Rebellion. This was a threat to the elite.
So they needed to break that alliance.
Precisely. They used a classic divide and conquer strategy. They intentionally created the idea of whiteness. They gave poor white workers certain privileges, maybe small plots of land, some authority over black individuals. They essentially told them, you may be poor, but you're white, like us. You're better than them.
Wow.
It was a way to turn poor whites against poor blacks, getting them to align with the wealthy landowners against their own economic interests. Menakem calls it an act of evil genius. And this effectively shifted that pre-existing white-on-white trauma into institutionalized white-on-black trauma. That became the bedrock of white body supremacy.
Okay, tracing that history really provides a different lens for looking at today. So let's connect that. How does this historical context, this embedded trauma, show up now, say, in law enforcement?
The connection is startlingly direct. Menakem points out that American policing has deep roots in slavery specifically, the slave patrols that started as early as the 1700s.
Right. Their job was literally to control and punish enslaved people.
Exactly. Managing black bodies. And that legacy, that fundamental structure and purpose, unfortunately, persists and influences policing today, especially in how interactions with black communities often unfold.
So this body-based understanding of trauma isn't just historical analysis. It directly impacts how we interact now. Menakem talks about white fragility, a term from Robin DiAngelo many might know. How does he frame that through this body lens?
He sees it less as just defensiveness and more as a physical, a reflexive protective response in white bodies. It's a way to avoid feeling the discomfort associated with their own historical trauma when confronted with racial issues.
So the discomfort itself feels like a threat.
Kind of, yeah, at that lizard brain level. Menakem gives examples where a white person's feeling of discomfort or perceived lack of safety in a situation involving a black person can escalate tragically. He mentions cases like Tamir Rice, Philando Castile.
Unarmed black men killed by police.
Right, where the officers often said, "I feared for my life." Menakem suggests this isn't always a calculated lie, but could be a genuine, visceral, trauma-driven bodily reaction perceiving lethal danger, where objectively, for that white body, there wasn't one.
That puts the "I feared for my life" defense
Yeah.
in a really different physiological light.
It does. Other examples he gives are things like quickly changing the subject, using statistics or legal arguments to deflect, blaming the victim, or just getting angry or offended when race comes up. There's often this underlying collective story of martyrdom, he mentions, where white bodies feel somehow frail or helpless when confronted by blackness.
Yeah, a profound way to think about those defensive reactions.
Yeah.
Now, flip side, what's the impact on black bodies? He talks about more than just overt violence, right? Microaggressions, lack of regard. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. He defines microaggressions as those small, constant, often unconscious ways white people express disregard or disdain, like the example of a cashier dropping change into a black person's hand instead of placing it there.
Little things that add up.
Exactly. Or a taxi driving past a black person for a white person down the street. And beyond those specific acts, there's what he calls an ongoing lack of human regard. Being ignored, interrupted, having your lived experience dismissed, hearing insincere apologies from officials. These aren't just annoying, they're visceral hits to the body, constantly signaling you don't belong or you aren't fully human.
And the coping mechanism for that.
Well, often, black bodies learn to habitually soothe the white body as a sheer survival strategy. Brent Staples' famous essay about whistling Vivaldi at night so white people wouldn't see him as a threat is a powerful example of that.
That's heartbreaking. It raises another crucial point. What about the police officers themselves? How does this dynamic affect them operating within this system?
It's a critical piece. Menakem argues police officers, regardless of their own race, end up functioning as part of the apparatus of white body supremacy. They become, in effect, managers and controllers of black bodies.
But they're also human, experiencing trauma themselves.
Definitely. Police work involves immense secondary trauma, constantly dealing with Violence, accidents, suffering. But, and this is key, they often lack the training or even the institutional culture to properly process and discharge that trauma energy from their own bodies.
So it just builds up.
It builds up, leading to chronic stress, burnout, sometimes that Gus versus them bunker mentality. Then you put these officers carrying their own unresolved trauma into heavily policed Black neighborhoods where residents are also carrying generations of trauma. Menakem describes it grimly as repeatedly traumatized bodies confronting other repeatedly traumatized bodies.
Vicious cycle.
And the increasing militarization of police departments often just makes that dynamic worse, creating more distance and fear, not less.
Okay, so we've really mapped out the depth of the problem, this inherited trauma living physically within us. Let's pivot to healing. Menakem makes a distinction between clean pain and dirty pain. What's the difference there?
That's a really central concept for the path forward. Clean pain is the discomfort that comes with growth. It's facing the truth, feeling the necessary grief or anger or shame, and moving through it to build resilience and capacity. It hurts, but it heals.
Okay, and dirty pain.
Dirty pain is the pain of avoidance. It's blame, denial, lashing out, staying stuck in reactivity. It's when we let our trauma run the show and it just creates more suffering and perpetuates the cycle. Menakem is really clear. Healing does not happen in your head, it happens in your body. You have to feel it to heal it.
Right, an embodied experience. So practically speaking, what are some of the body-based things individuals can actually do to start this process?
He offers some really accessible practices focused on settling the nervous system, working with what he calls the soul nerve, the vagus nerve. Simple things. Anchoring practices, he calls them, like just taking a moment to notice physical sensations in your body instead of reacting impulsively, accepting discomfort without judgment, finding ways to discharge pent-up energy.
Like what kind of ways?
Even simple things, humming or making an om sound can be incredibly settling because of the vibration. Gentle rocking, feeling your feet on the ground grounding, self-touch, like placing a hand on your heart or belly. And he really emphasizes basic self-care. Getting enough sleep, eating well, hydration, movement, finding simple pleasures, maybe meditation. These aren't luxuries. They're fundamental for building the resilience needed to do this work.
Those sound manageable, grounded, literally.
Yeah.
But how do we scale this up? How does this move from individual practice to healing communities, changing the culture?
That's the next crucial step. Collective healing. He suggests several approaches. One is harmonizing with others doing body-based practices together. Think group humming, singing, maybe even silent walks where you just sync up your steps, or supportive touch like a hand on the shoulder if appropriate. It builds communal settling.
Okay, what else?
Another powerful one is completing thwarted actions. This means symbolically or sometimes even literally addressing past harms to release that stuck energy. When a community does this, it can actually help heal wounds from previous generations and prevent passing them on.
That sounds intense, but potentially transformative.
It really is. Then, for African Americans specifically, he talks about addressing traumatic retentions. This involved looking at survival strategies passed down through generations, things that were once protective but might now be harmful, like maybe harsh discipline styles born out of fear for a child's safety in a racist world, or internalized issues like colorism. It's about consciously choosing what to keep and what to let go of.
And for white Americans?
For white Americans, a big part is creating new culture. Deliberately building something different from white body supremacy. This could mean forming groups to study this material, developing new rituals or stories focused on resilience without supremacy, and consciously using their privilege in everyday ways, like choosing to sit next to a Black person on the bus or intentionally seeking out Black professionals. It's about actively trying to separate whiteness from supremacy.
And finally, police culture.
Reshaping police culture is huge. It starts with officers learning to manage their own bodies, their own trauma first, prioritizing self-care, then really embracing genuine community policing, walking beats, talking to people, volunteering locally, not just showing up for arrests, training in psychological first aid, and fundamentally shifting the metrics away from just arrest towards actual problem solving and fostering justice, trying to break that cycle of traumatized bodies, confronting traumatized bodies.
It really sounds like, although the specifics vary, the core principle is this conscious, embodied engagement with the trauma. He shares a personal story, doesn't he? About his mother challenging his grandmother's colorism.
Yes, it's a very moving example. His mother's pushback created, as he says, room for growth for him, breaking an inherited pattern. It powerfully illustrates how individual choices matter.
Yeah.
It underlines his fundamental message. Trauma is not destiny. By making a conscious choice not to pass on the trauma, to interrupt those patterns in our own lives and bodies, we start healing ourselves and building resilience for those who come after us. It's an act of profound agency.
This has been, well, a truly deep dive. The core takeaway seems to be that racial trauma isn't some abstract idea out there. It's something we carry physically, viscerally, often without realizing it. And healing has to start right there, in our bodies, with conscious attention to our sensations.
Exactly. This whole exploration is really an invitation, isn't it? An invitation to acknowledge that reality, the presence of this historical and racialized trauma within us, and then to commit to these kinds of body-centered practices. It definitely takes courage. It means being willing to feel that clean pain we talked about, but that's the path toward more integrity, more capacity for all of us.
So as we wrap up, maybe something for you, the listener, to consider. What's just one small body-centered practice you could try integrating into your daily life, starting today? Something to begin gently unsettling that legacy of trauma within you, and maybe create just a little more space for genuine connection and collective healing.